Heather Berlin is a cognitive neuroscientist and assistant professor at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. She's the host of the PBS series Science Goes to the Movies and the Discovery Channel series Superhuman Showdown, and has made numerous appearances, including on the BBC, History Channel, Netflix, StarTalk with Neil deGrasse Tyson, and TEDx. She's going to speak about recent research in neuroscience and its implications for our understandings of consciousness. Welcome, Heather.
Hello. So the reason I became a neuroscientist really was because I was fascinated by this big question of how can this physical piece of matter, this 3-pound piece of matter that's in our skulls, give us all of our subjective experiences, everything we feel from the moment we wake up until we go back into a deep, dreamless sleep. And it's a quite complex piece of matter, but again, we're limited by our own the brain itself, by limited to understanding itself, which is also a fascinating kind of concept. And there's some who don't think we'll ever really understand it because we're limited to understand the world around us by this 3-pound chunk of sort of, well, not fleshy, but there's a lot of fat in there. But it's made out of, neurons is the basic unit of information processing in the brain. The brain has about 100 billion neurons. Each one of those neurons has about 1,000 to 10,000 synapses or connections, which means there's about 100 trillion connections in the human brain. It's really complex. There's more connections in the human brain than there are stars in the Milky Way. And as George said before, it's really, we kind of tend to think of it like this information processing machine. And it encodes everything we experience. The really fascinating thing is that, it's a myth that we only use 10% of our brain. We use all of it. None of it is redundant, but we're really only conscious of a very little bit of it. So everybody's fascinated by this question of consciousness. But, another question is, what about all those unconscious processes that are affecting our behavior, the decisions we make, and what makes those unconscious processes, which are very complex in and of themselves, different from the neural processes that we are conscious of? So this field, it just began to emerge in the sort of mid-1990s of it becoming a legitimate scientific study to try to understand what the neural correlates of consciousness are. And that was because it was Francis Crick, who co-discovered DNA, who really put forth the idea that we can study this question, which was usually left to the domain of philosophy. We can study it with the tools of science. But how do we do that? So one technique is to, in the lab, present people with stimuli, physical stimuli. It's being processed it's going into your retina, your visual cortex, is processing this information, and seeing what changes when you're either conscious of the stimuli or not. And we can manipulate the stimuli by making it subliminally, you're subliminally aware of it. So it's either presented in a kind of convoluted way, or it's presented very quickly, so you claim to not consciously see anything, but it still gets in, or in a degraded way that you claim, I don't really see it, but yet the brain is still processing that information. So here's an example of stimuli we can use in the lab. So raise your hand if you can see the subliminal message here. Nobody? 1, 2, okay, 2 people. I know what you guys are thinking. Okay, so here you can see in the negative space here by the roots, you see S-E-X, right? And you have the birds and the bees and the flowers are kind of like loving towards each other. Now, once you see it, you can't unsee it. If I showed you this, in an hour, it would pop right out at you. So the question is, even though all the physical photons were hitting your retina being processed by a visual cortex, the same exact physical stimuli was there, but something changed in your brain. And that's what we want to track, the neural correlates of your perception. What changed between when you didn't see it and when you did? And there's just all sorts of things that, I don't know, these are just fun images because things that just get out there and people aren't, consciously picking it up. This is Parents Magazine, if you didn't know. And also, this is another one which is interesting. Raise your hand if you can see the subliminal message here. Oh, wow, you all see? Okay, so you guys all see the 9 dolphins, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. See them? Wow. And this is also interesting because depending on where you are in life, so if you ask kids, prepubescent kids, what they see, they right away see the 9 dolphins. That's all they see. And you see something different. And so it's, again, the same physical stimuli, but what's changing is your perception. And that's what we want to track. And there's all sorts of visual illusions the brain uses. For example, here it looks as if square A and B are different shades, right? But actually, this is the shadow illusion. They're physically the same exact color. But because there's a shadow laying on the square B, our brain makes an approximation, and it changes our perception. So what we're perceiving in our mind's eye doesn't necessarily correlate with actually what's out there in reality. This is just a fun example. Remember the dress phenomena? Right? So it was really like blue and black, but some people saw it as white and gold, and it was because light was hitting it. So some people's brains lightened it up and went one way, and other people's went another way. And again, we can't always necessarily agree on what's out there, what's reality. So this is what you can do in the lab. You have, for example, here, you can either see this as the old woman looking down, that's her chin and her nose and her mouth, or a young woman looking away, that's her chin, her nose, her eyelashes. But you'll never see them both at the same time, right? It'll flip back and forth in your mind's eye, like the duck and the rabbit, or this Necker cube, which the front face will go, it'll either kind of pop out or pop back in. And we can use these bistable images and say, okay, what's happening in your brain when you're perceiving the old woman? And what changes when you're seeing the young woman? And how is, again, we're tracking the neural correlates of perception. So with these kinds of techniques, and some much more advanced as well, there's been a whole array of, I'm not going through all these, but just to give you an idea of some of the proposals of what the neural correlates of consciousness are. Some tie it to specific parts in the brain. Some talk about you need these feedback loops, these thalamocortical loops of information, 40 hertz oscillations in the cerebral cortex. So there's a lot of things out there. One idea that's gotten a lot of, there's a lot of evidence to support, is that what tends to correlate with what we're perceiving at any given moment is these coalitions of neurons start to sort of fire together. So if you think about it like a parliamentary election, you have these certain people, they all tend to kind of vote together, and then they come into power, and that's sort of what comes into your consciousness at that given moment. Those coalitions of neurons can fire together, for like 10 seconds, or 1 to 3 seconds, depending. If you're tending to someone, they'll stay in power longer until another coalition kind of wins the election. And that's kind of the ebb and flow of your conscious perception. I use this analogy because this is actually a Twitter feed. And so if you think about it, if each tweet is like a neuron firing, and when enough people tweet about something, it trends. And so that comes sort of into our public consciousness. So you can kind of think of it that until something else trends and sort of takes over public awareness. And it's also important to remember that it's happening in these distributed networks across the brain. So it's not just in one place. And these neurons, so when you're hearing, when you're seeing, when you're feeling all at the same time, that's happening in these long distance connections across the brain. And they're not all coming together in like sort of one place, like this Cartesian theater where there's this person in there just watching it like a movie. It's all happening separately, but the rate at which they fire is what kind of gives you this cohesive conscious experience. And this was a sort of what we call the binding problem. How does it all bind together? And it's not that the neurons are all firing at the same time, because that would be sort of like an epileptic seizure, that when they're in sync, they're not firing at the same time, but in coordination. So you can think of it like, a wave in a crowd. Not everybody's standing up at the same time, but they're doing it in sync, and that's kind of how these neurons are communicating with each other. And one other theory in consciousness is that you have this sort of global workspace theory. So this is work that's done by Stan Dehaene's group in France, and basically what they do is they show stimuli and they mask it. So if you show something and then you quickly show another image in front of it, you're blind to the first image. So it's a way that you can present, again, stimuli, but people are not aware that they're seeing it. And what they find is that when you present it and it's strongly masked, so it's presented subliminally, you get activation in these early visual areas. This is for visual stimuli. And as the threshold of the masking lifts, you start to get more and more activation in higher parts of the brain, in secondary visual processing areas. And finally, when you're fully conscious of the information, you get activation in prefrontal cortex and these kind of feedback loops that feed back to the primary sensory cortices, or the primary visual cortex in this case. And in terms of the timing of the activation, around 300 milliseconds after the presentation of the stimulus, you get this peak activation. And what they call that is the P3B wave, and when you measure it with EEG, and they thought that was the neural correlate of consciousness. But in a very recent study, what they did was they gave people what's called an oddball task. So they showed them the word, let's say, right, 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 and occasionally left. And they masked that, so people weren't claiming to see anything. But what they found was that even with the subliminally presented oddball task, when the oddball was presented, you would get this strong P3B wave. So you're getting it outside of consciousness. So what it's basically telling us is that that activation happens when there's some more complex processing happening in the brain, or it's noticing something different, but it's not correlated necessarily with consciousness. So again, with all these theories, there's usually a lot of evidence to support it, but then you come across things that maybe it doesn't tell you the whole picture. So finally, I'm just going to touch upon this last theory where George talked about a bit, the integrated information theory of consciousness. And this is an information theory where basically it says that consciousness is a property of the universe. So any system that happens to have what they call integrated differentiated information processing. Integrated in the sense that it's the theory of it's a causal theory. So if you had pixels in a camera and one pixel died out, it wouldn't affect the pixel next to it. But in the case of integrated information, like if one neuron fires, it affects the next one, and it's an integrated system. So what Giulio says, and more recently, Christoph Koch, who's a neuroscientist, has been a big proponent of this theory as well, is that any system that has a high degree of differentiated integrated information will have the property of consciousness. It's just like it exists, like the property of gravity exists. And the brain just happens to be one of those systems. But other systems can have it too. And they've come up with this calculation of how much integrated information a system has. They call it phi. And you can basically calculate it in any system. Does a bee have it? Does a fetus have it? Does an ant have it? Does a person in a particular coma have it? And you can see how much consciousness there is with this measure. And so, you can see in an unconscious brain, you would only also get feed-forward information. Here you have a minimally conscious brain where parts of the brain, they're not fully integrated. So you might have some consciousness, but not the same experience as you would have if you had a fully integrated conscious brain. And also with this theory, they claim that you can't have consciousness simulated in a computer because it's like simulating the weather in a computer. It wouldn't have the feeling of wetness, right? And so there's something about the physical structure. So if you wanted to simulate consciousness, you'd actually have to build like a neuromorphic machine that has the structure and the information flowing. You can't just simulate it. Like Henry Macrom is doing computer simulations of the brain, but you actually would need a real physical system that has the same causal properties that the brain has. And if you can build that, then that could have consciousness potentially, but it's not going to be in any kind of a simulation. How much time do I have left? Okay, so that basically is one of the big theories in consciousness right now. I just wanted to touch on something just because it's more related to the stuff that I'm interested in right now, is that the brain, the other point I want to make is that, it's made up of these structures, and it's evolved, right, over time. So you have these older structures in the brain here in red that are evolutionary older, that are processing information outside of awareness. Basic things like they're pushing you forward for immediate pleasure or avoidance of pain. You have more recently evolved parts of the brain like the prefrontal cortex, which are thinking about the future consequences of your actions and tend to be more related with conscious processing. And one question is, how can we in the lab access these subcortical areas that are normally being processing things outside of awareness and kind of bring them to the forefront, trying to understand what's going on outside of awareness. And one thing that I've become interested in is actually freestyle rap. My husband happens to be a rapper, and which is was fascinating. And when people are improvising, when they're in that flow state, they actually, you actually are accessing certain parts of unconscious processes. And so one question, we actually put him in the scanner, had him do a memorized rap and a freestyle rap, and found, and this was a previous study that was done, a preliminary study, which had a small group of people, but they had rappers doing this in the scanner, and found that actually when you're improvising, when you're in that moment of spontaneous creativity, you actually have a unique pattern of brain activation where parts of that prefrontal cortex, the kind of more conscious parts, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex here in blue, are turned down. And other parts of the brain, like the medial prefrontal cortex here in orange, are turned up. And what we think is happening in that state is that filtering system where you're kind of filtering your behavior to make sure it conforms to social norms, where you're like very self-aware, is turned down. So when people are in a flow state, you lose your sense of time and place and self. It feels like it's coming through you. And it allows for these unconscious processes to come to the surface, which are normally being kind of maybe suppressed or repressed or kept out of consciousness. And it was interesting is that we did the same study in jazz musicians who were improvising versus doing memorized, and found this similar pattern of activation: decreased activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, increased activation in the medial prefrontal cortex. So there might be this sort of neural signature of improvisation, which just in terms of working with patients and in therapy, it might be a technique that we can use to access unconscious processes in the brain. So, and that being said, there are also other states that you can see a similar pattern of activation during hypnosis, daydreaming, certain types of meditation, REM sleep. You get decreased activation in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and it allows for the sort of novel associations between ideas to be made. So the more I kind of peer into the brain, the more I realize how much we don't really understand. But the one thing we can glean from all of this is that the more we can kind of look inward, they say know thyself, and try to understand our unconscious processes, the more we can perhaps live more in harmony with our long-term goals. And this is what a lot of therapeutic techniques try to do, is try to give us insight into these unconscious kind of processes that are motivating us behind the scenes. And ultimately, we'll gain wisdom, which is experience, knowledge, and good judgment. So that's it for now, and thank you.